I was literally strapped to the hood of a car with 2 cables, and my feet were propped up on the front. We built just a little thing so I could have resistance so I wouldn't fall off the front of the car. We were drifting around corners trying to stay very close to the car I was chasing that Hemsworth was in, and it was very dusty. We were going under a tunnel, and the lead car was in front of us. It skidded around the corner, kicked up some dust so we couldn't see. He had spun out and come to a stop. We didn't have time to brake, and we T-boned his car. Very fortunately, my feet went up into the wheel well, a few feet one way or the other, and my feet might have been crushed. Things like that, putting myself right there in the action, I felt necessary to capture the sequence in the way I wanted to see it, and that I think fans deserve. My name is Sam Hargrave, director of Extraction. This is how we made a nearly 12-minute action sequence look like one continuous shot.
Kid, you trust me?
No.
Good.
No!
I've done stunt work for such films as Warrior, The Avengers, Captain America, The Winter Soldier, Captain America Civil War. I made the leap from stunt coordinating to directing as a natural progression of my path in the entertainment industry. I'd always wanted to direct. Even when I was a young kid, we had like a VHS camera that I'd set up these action scenes. A lot of times it was Louis L'Amour books that I was inspired by, where there was always a gunfight and a fist fight. For me, a desire to tell stories and perform action and do fun stuff that I read about in books and later saw in Hong Kong cinema. Extraction came about in the production process for Infinity War. I was stunt coordinating and second unit directing that film with the Russo brothers, who I met on Captain America: The Winter Soldier. And I told Joe throughout our history together that I wanted to direct movies. He didn't make a big deal of it, to kind of filed that away. Then while we were on Infinity War, he said, hey, I have a script that I think you might be perfect for as a director. So I read the script. I said, I would love to do it. He said, great. I think having a background as a stunt coordinator greatly informs my decisions as a director, because I've been through most of the things that I'm then directing in front of the camera. Whatever I've asked Chris or any other stunt performer to do, I've either done myself or have designed, to some degree. I think coming from an action background, it's a language that I speak fluently, and if I didn't have that experience, it might be a little harder to arrive at the action to the level that I wanted. Part of the reason why I decided to operate camera in the first place was because I spoke the language. The look and feel of the shots in the movie were very much related to my experience, my upbringing, if you will, as a stunt performer and a coordinator, because when I would perform these things or design action to be seen in a specific way that was not the right way, wrong way, just different. It was how I saw it. Oftentimes, the director that I'd work for would shoot it a different way, edit it a different way, that would sometimes not be in alignment with how I kind of designed it to be seen or experienced. And that would be frustrating. So having a background in action informed where I put the camera. Because we had a performer, an actor as talented as Chris Hemsworth, you weren't hiding anything. You didn't have to make up for inadequacies or say, hey, he's not quite getting this timing, let's cut around this moment. We just lived in long, continuous takes to kind of revel in the ability of this actor and his character. Coming back around, I think Chad Stahelski and David Leitch with the John Wick movies kind of have made that vogue again, and I appreciate them for that. They also come from an action background. But for me, I wanted to continue that kind of trend because it's how I grew up watching action in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s of Hong Kong cinema. And I feel like it's, I don't know, for me, action is a way to tell a story in a dynamic way. And if you're not able to see what's happening, if you're not able to experience it as the characters do, then you're missing a lot of the impact of the moment. I didn't go into the film, and when reading it, I never thought about one take. I don't usually think about technical stuff when I'm reading it. I'm usually thinking about the story, how do we tell this story in the most exciting, efficient way. As production got further along and we were kind of restrained financially and with our schedule, the idea started to form in my mind that the only way to pull this off might be to make it one sequential long take. The concept of a oneer is that it's one long, continuous shot where you tell a story through action, narrative, or whatever, but without cutting, you tell that story from start to finish. Not only do all the moves and all the dialogue in that bit have to be what you want, but the end of the take has to be what you know is going to match the beginning of the next one, or at least hope. It was probably a 15, 20-page action sequence that was written like Bourne Identity sequence or a James Bond sequence, and I knew we did not have the time, money, and resources to do that. You have to shoot these sequences so many times over and over again to get the right coverage. I thought, well, what if we reduce that coverage by making it all one shot? This sequence arrives in our film when Tyler Rake is in the middle of extracting Ovi from the city of Taka. There's a turning point where he's about to get the kid to safety, and a new player enters the equation, Saju, who has also been tasked to rescue the kid. So you have two, heroes basically, one anti-hero and one hero at odds, who don't know that each other has the same mission, trying to get this kid out. It's the great turning point where we head into Act 2. Our oneer sequence is officially 11 minutes and 29 seconds of a continuous one shot in the final product. It's made up of a lot of different stitches made to look seamless, but I believe it was 36 different stitches, 36 different segments that we had to put together to look like one continuous take. Sometimes one of those sequences could take as many as 20, 25 takes to get it right. Say you're at between stitch 7 and 8. And when you finish 8, you predetermine where 7 and 8 are going to mix. So when you finish 7, you have to start 8, overlapping that shot or continue it in exactly the same framing so you can blend them together seamlessly.
You hit him in the truck.
Yep.
I'm not saying that the only way to tell these stories is through long continuous take, but for this particular moment, it was just like, what would it feel like for the audience to be involved in a rescue mission? Thought one of the most exciting ways would be to just dump the audience in there and say, hey, get out with us. With a sequence like this, there are many challenges, and they can be broken down into different categories. You got props, there's locations, hair, makeup, and wardrobe, cinematography, don't forget about sound, there's stunts, which is integral to something like this, vehicles, and safety. Each of these different categories presented its own unique challenge that many of my crew and I had never faced before. First of all, props. The challenge here was shooting in India. There is a countrywide ban on firearms. We didn't learn this until we were a few weeks away from production, so we ended up having to shoot our entire oneer sequence with rubber prop guns. Normally, you'd have different layers of guns. You'd have your for close-ups or different bits. You'd have your reelies. You'd have your hero guns. Then you'd have blank firing guns and/or airsoft weapons, so that the mechanics of the weapon move and interact, so that the performers can get a feel for them. And then you'd have your rubber props. So when you're interacting and fighting or throwing a gun or someone gets hit in the face, you're safe. And that's kind of the way it's broken down with those 3 different levels. We could not import any of our weapons, and in India we scoured the whole country and you couldn't find the kind of firearms that we wanted our characters to have. So it went through quite a process, but we were able to import the rubber guns because there were no moving parts. They were just cast rubber. We shot our entire sequence, shootouts, chases with rubber guns. For a movie of this size and scale is insane. We had to just work with the actors because there's no recoil, there's no action. We have to work with them on, and not saying bang, bang, because when you interact with another performer and you're firing, usually there's some sort of sound or indication that the gun has gone off, so you can duck, you can move, you can hide. There's nothing. So either I'm calling off screen while I'm behind camera saying bang, bang, the rhythm, and they got to follow my rhythm. Or the other performers have to watch, and when they do their action with their hands, they have to fall. And then later, in post, we have to go in and digitally animate those guns so that they look real. I'm pretty impressed that we overcame, and I'd be interested to see if anybody, if they didn't hear this interview, knew that we shot the entire sequence without a single blank firing gun. They were all rubber. Okay, next we have location. Now, the challenge of shooting a sequence like this on any location is because it travels so much, you have to lock down and make safe a lot of space. So if we're driving a car down, a half a mile of road, all of that distance has to be locked down and made safe. So that's no matter where you are. But since we were shooting this sequence in Ahmedabad, India, which is a very populated city with lots of people, lots of animals, lots of children, our locations became extremely challenging because on certain days, when we would lock down, like I said, like a half mile of stretch of street to do this car sequence in, we'd have some days 200-300 security personnel because we had to be inside every doorway, make sure that every cow, dog, and chicken and human was accounted for so they did not run out into the road and cause an accident. That was a huge challenge, with safety at these locations. And some of the other challenges of those locations were access. To get our crews there, we shot in buildings that were a little dilapidated. Sometimes we had to rebuild the structures to make them safe. India is an amazing place. They're constantly stimulated by sound, smells, sights. So a day of working out in these environments, you'd come home and you'd just be exhausted because of the constant stimuli. And so these locations were extremely challenging. So next category is hair, makeup, and wardrobe, vanities as they call them. The challenge here was we were in locations where it was very hot. The characters and actors were all very active. I mean, it's a chase scene, fight scene, so you're constantly sweating. For wardrobe, if you start with a dry shirt, by the time you do take 2, Chris is drenched head to toe, and now that doesn't match the previous, so you can't use it. So we're like, you know what? He's gonna be sweating. When the takes are good, he's gonna be sweating. So let's just, it's hot. Let's just drench him. So we'd soak him down with a spray bottle of water to keep the continuity for the wardrobe, which was a challenge because there is you're not cutting away to other things. You're with the character the whole time, and it's supposed to be, continuous take. So if from one moment to another, the wardrobe looks different or changes, you got a big problem.
Stay on my shoulder, right?
Then with our makeup, we had a lot of special effects makeup because during the course of the fight, the different characters sustain different wounds. Like Saju at one point gets cut, with a knife on the arm. So we'd have to build in our stitch around that point to where we could go in and add that prosthetic and the blood, and then from that point on, you had to keep up with the continuity. And another one in the makeup category that was constantly, made things so frustrating at times, is we wanted to put some distinguishing tattoos on Tyler Rake. So we had some on his neck. We did kind of think it through of, you don't want to have, if he's got exposed forearms, you don't want to have tattoos all over his hands and arms that aren't his, because then you have to reapply them every time he sweats. But we had the one on the neck, and we were like, it looks really cool to poke up a little bit out of the shirt. It did look cool, but that became one of the most challenging parts of the shoot, is just the continuity of the tattoo that you don't think about when you're like, it's cool, it looks great. But it also rubs off as soon as he gets a little sweaty, and then he turns this way, and he turns back, and now he's got a mark through the tattoo. And you had to make the decision after the end of the take. If it was a great take, but the tattoo was all messed up, you're like, oh man, hey, can we fix this in post? Or do we have to reapply the tattoo and start again because of that? It would take 20, 30 minutes while everybody got their chance to look on the monitors and make sure that their part was right before we moved on to continue. Then there's cinematography. Without cinematography, there's no movie. But how do you capture this sequence? What is the gear that you use to effectively run around with people and jump off of buildings and strap yourself to a car? Do you do that with the big full-size camera with a full-size lens package that weighs 35 to 40 pounds? No. You can, but it just makes your life so much harder. So Tom Siegel, our director of photography, and I spoke long and hard about what was the best configuration of these tools to allow me, because I was going to operate this sequence, the most freedom of movement to put the camera where I wanted to put it and to capture the action how I saw it. One of the unique challenges of this sequence was operating the camera and putting it in places that you might not normally find a camera, or photographing this car chase in a way that you haven't really necessarily seen before. And I took a lot of that on my own shoulders, because with my understanding of the danger of certain situations and how to react to be safe, I thought it was best that I operate camera and shoot this sequence for a couple reasons. Safety, like I just mentioned, but the other is you can't point the finger at anybody but yourself if you don't get the shot. So we ended up with the red Monstra. We had a compact lens package. We boiled it down. It was probably, at the end of it, maybe between 12 and 18 pounds. Sometimes I would have, for different things, I'd have a battery belt or a backpack to make it even lighter with a long cable. Other times when I needed to have the freedom or safety of not being attached to it, I would put the battery pack on the camera, so that would increase the weight. We had, and different configurations for that camera. Like when I had to, with the camera, dive through the open window of a car, we had to make everything as small as possible. It'd be like a playbook. You'd look on your, call it out, next setup, configuration number 2. And because we'd rehearsed it so long, and people knew what that was, they were on it. Because the action is so dynamic and crazy in that from a cinematic standpoint, where technically you can't just set the focus like I'm sitting here now and the focus is kind of fixed. If I start moving around crazy, I'm out of focus, and the next thing you know, the shot's ruined. Almost attached to the hips, we had our focus puller. He was connected, electronically and remotely, so he could operate from a monitor, in another room if I was running down hallways or whatnot. But more often than not, he was right beside me, going from my monitor and field, because he was kind of old school. So he would be running with me or circling and rolling through these fight sequences, and he'd be right there with me, ducking punches and ducking kicks and holding focus. And it was a dance, not only with the performers in front of the camera, but with the department behind. So in a way, one of the most interesting behind the scenes thing would be is to turn that camera around on us shooting it, and to see that little army of people moving through, and the dance that we had to choreograph to make it work was incredible. It was very important for the look to also be as cinematic and beautiful as possible. So we would design these sequences around time of day, so that most of our action we could try to backlight it, because that was a big thing for me, a big thing for Tom, was just to make it as beautiful as possible. If you don't photograph it well, the action is just bad theater. And we would design our day around location and where the sun was, so that we get these nice lens flares or nice backlit shots, especially during hero moments for Rake or for Obi. Then, you can't forget about sound. Sound in these kinds of sequences is so important. Try watching your favorite action scene and push mute. I would say at least half, more than half of the impact of an action scene is the sound. And we had guys falling, we had cars crashing, we had the grunts and groans, so we really wanted sound to be involved in that. But again, they had to learn the dance and have our boom operator be right there with us. Now, we would place mics throughout the set, hide them, so that we could pick up things and not have, certain places it was too narrow or too dangerous to have the sound operators with us. So we'd have to make the choice based on safety to have them stand down on a certain sequence. But as much as possible, we had them right there in the action, and they just had to learn the dance. And very rarely did we have to go again because we saw a boom in the shot. But occasionally it's going to happen, because sometimes, like we talked about earlier, the improv of a scene, of a little bit of give and take, if the actors end up not where we did before, you can't blame the boom guy for being where he's supposed to be. Stunts. How can you have a sequence like this without stunts? You can't. The stunt department, led by Daniel Stevens, my good friend and the stunt coordinator for this film, and Michael Lair, our fight choreographer, from the beginning, from the moment I would devise an idea or come up with a place that I wanted to shoot, they would right away, I would call them up and say, hey, we got to go to this location. When I would design sequences, I like to see the location and let my mind wander and come up with great ideas. I'd like to be there as much as I can. Sometimes, as the director, I had other, obligations. I'd have to go to a production meeting, or I'd have to go somewhere else. So I heavily involved the stunt team, had them go to these locations and take what they had been designing from early on, before even knowing it was a Warner, just designing action for the Tyler Rake character. And, based on the location, maybe it has to change. If the fight you designed in a 4-wall, flat, normal a studio situation or a rehearsal space. Now you're on stairs. How do you change it? Is it now this kick versus that punch? I relied heavily on Michael and Daniel, and they really delivered. Once we designed it in the space, they would go back with the actors, usually after a day of preparing other things on their busy schedule, or even a shooting day. They'd go back and rehearse the action with the actors late into the night. And so, that was the fight action. That was the physical interaction, which a lot of this was. Then we had, two other layers. One of which was the wire work. We had a great, wire rigging team there. You had to rehearse those so they were, spot on, because again, when you get this team effort, you don't want to be the weak link where it's all great. You did this all big thing, and then you do the wire jump, and now the wires weren't prepared, and so now you got to do it again, or even worse, when you're working at heights or with wires, somebody gets hurt. So they were extensively rehearsed. We did shoot a lot of these things just to test them and make sure that the concept worked before we shot them. Many movies do storyboards or previs. We call it fight viz, and we would take camera, the stunt doubles, and we'd go on location and we would shoot these stunts to make sure they worked. Third level, which will lead us into the next category, but is a lot of the driving that was done. We brought in a great team of drivers who had to operate the vehicles and make sure they were safe and hitting marks. Whenever you're dealing with vehicles, you've now introduced like another element of danger, because you're going at high speeds, you've got a motorized vehicle, so you want the best people for the job. And again, we would rehearse all of these things on location. We knew like the bends in the road, like the potholes we had to fix. How do we do this as smoothly and safely as possible? Because when it comes to shooting time or shooting day, there's only a certain amount of time, and it has to be ready. Next, we have vehicles. Now, in a sequence like this, because it's a chase scene, yes, we do some foot chases. Yes, we jump over buildings and fight and fall and do all that fun stuff. But one of the big, exciting parts is the vehicle portion. When Tyler Rake gets into his car and it's a car chase. So to pull off a lot of the things we wanted to do to make them unique and really get the actors into the action, we decided to kind of specially modify our vehicles. And for example, we'll take Rake's car, his Mercedes, as a template, and we had 4 different configurations of this car. We had the hero car, which was, drove regularly. The actor could drive it, stop, get out. It worked like a normal car. Then we had what we called the back seat drive car. And we had a pod car, and then a crash car. The backseat drive car, for sequences when the camera was outside of the vehicle and moving in and around and trying these dynamic moves, I wanted it to look like Chris was actually driving. As good a driver as he is, it's too dangerous to have him trying to act and steer the car, and what if he crashes? So we take the control out of his hands and put it in a professional stunt driver. And to hide them, we put them in the back seat of the car. And Steve, our vehicle master, he and his team just reorganized and re-engineered and just Frankenstein these cars together. We moved the steering wheel, the operating steering wheel, and the gas and brakes to the back of the car, so that when you look at it, it was really fascinating. You'd have the stunt performer cramped into the back of the car, kind of behind the back seats. We removed the back seats, he was cramped back in there, but had foot pedal, the gas, and his little steering wheel, but just hidden in the back, so you couldn't see him. Chris had a steering wheel, but you could turn it as much as you wanted, and it would not affect the car. What that allowed us to do was to get right in there front with a camera vehicle, or for me, strapped to the front of a vehicle, and see Chris driving the car when in fact it was being safely and professionally driven by a stunt performer. The next version of the car, the pod car, when the camera would be inside the car and we'd see Chris driving and we see Rudy reacting and them going through these environments. We wanted again to be safe and have the control in the hands of someone who does this for a living, and so we put the stunt driver on top of the car. We got a lot of interesting looks from pedestrians, but you fly down the street with the driver on top of the car in a little cage. They built a nice safe roll cage in case something went wrong and the car turns over, the stunt driver is safe. But it looked like a little go-kart welded to the top of a Mercedes, and he was down with his little steering wheel and the gas and brakes, and he controlled everything from top of the car, so that I had the freedom with the camera inside to look 360 degrees, and it appears that, you know, the lead character, Chris, is driving the car through these insanely close turns and you know, crashing through things. We crashed through a gate, like a practical gate. You know, we reinforced the windshield so nothing could come through, but we crashed through, and it looks like Chris is driving, when in fact it's the stunt driver, you know, doing what he does. And then the last iteration of that car was the crash car, where at one point we, you know, in reverse, we crash into a police car that's chasing us. So that had all of the roll cages, the safety harnesses bolted in, so that when the stunt performer crashed the car, it was safe. So 4 iterations of one car, and that was just the one character's car. We had to do similar iterations for, you know, Saju's car, for the hero truck, because they transfer from this car, they fight for a while, they run on foot, and then they get in another truck. So we did the same versions for the truck. So the number of vehicles it took, and the coordination and alterations it took to make these vehicles do what I needed them to do was an insanely challenging but extremely rewarding part of this process. Safety is paramount. For me, safety is the most important thing on a film set. Yes, you want to have fun and you want to get great footage, but if you're not doing it safely, if people can't go home to their families, it's not worth it. So Lee Cleary, the first AD, and I, along with a stunt coordinator and everyone, really, safety was really on the forefront of our mind, especially in these densely populated locations where we had cars flying by, or, you know, foot chases, or people fighting. So on certain days for the car chase, we had 200 to 300 security personnel located at different, you know, alleyways, doorways. It was everyone's job for the, you know, half mile of run that we needed to lock it down and make it safe. And, you know, we didn't have a single accident. We had a great safety team. You know, we were very particular about being where we needed to be, when we needed to be there, so that everyone, you know, went home safely. There were also interesting aspects of these locations that Phil Ivey found that were very kind of dilapidated, had a lot of character, a lot of texture, a lot of great colors and levels to them. But some of them were so dilapidated that they were dangerous to interact with. If we wanted to get up on a staircase or to this balcony, we'd have to structurally modify the building a little bit to make it safe. We use a lot of creative ways to make things safe and execute this sequence to the best of our ability. One of the most important lessons I learned was about communication and preparation. Without those, how can you tell people what you need? How can you get your vision across? If you can't communicate what you want, how can people help you achieve that? So you got to communicate, and you got to be prepared. Preparation and rehearsal is everything. And actually, a good friend of mine and mentor, Chad Stahelski, once told me, know everyone's job better than they do. And for me, that means is just know what the standard is, know what the job entails, know how good it needs to be in order to be, you know, the high standard in that field or in that specific category, whatever it may be. But you also have to be open to other ideas, other suggestions, because you don't know everything. You know, that's one of the, I think, great mistakes, is to go into a situation like making a film thinking that you have all the answers, because if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I think it's important to be open enough to consider that honestly and openly and think, is this the best idea for the movie? It might not have been my idea, but is it the best idea for the movie? Because the best idea should always win.